This is Angelina Love, and today I'm interviewing Mike Cohen of the Center for Brain Training in Jupiter, Florida, about brain mapping and how important it can be for targeting treatment options. Mike, to start with, why don't you take a minute or two and tell us about your clinic and your experience in neurofeedback?
I've been involved in neurofeedback since 1996, so that's about 17 years at this point. And we've developed two neurofeedback centers, one in Boca Raton and one in Jupiter, Florida. We focus on helping people get their brain working better, and that covers a lot of different kinds of issues, from sleep to attention to mood to anxiety to migraines.
Today we're talking about brain mapping, and why don't you start with telling us what brain mapping is?
Brain mapping gives us a tool for helping identify what's going on in the brain, what kind of problem are we really targeting, how are we going to help address that problem. And if you don't have some kind of picture or some kind of pattern that you can identify, you're not really sure often what you're dealing with. So there's a variety of different kinds of brain maps, which including SPECT scans and MRIs and something called quantitative EEG. We focus on quantitative EEG type brain maps because it most correlates to a lot of how we process information.
And why is a brain map important for what you do with neurofeedback?
Well, it's not only important for what we do in neurofeedback, but in helping come up with strategies for change. So when you see a specific brain pattern, and quantitative EEG identifies where your EEG, your brain pattern, differs from the average. If there is a significant difference in your left temporal lobe compared to other people's left temporal lobe, what is that affecting, and how does that create some of the problems that you may be dealing with and that you inadvertently don't even know? It allows us, in terms of our center, it allows anyone really doing neurofeedback, if you have a good map and know how to use that, to come up with a strategy, not only what the problem is, but how to address the problem. How do you get people to make changes to that pattern that allow them to function better, to sleep better, to control their emotions better, to control their attention? It's a very practical tool, and sometimes it helps identify what medication might be appropriate.
And how does it do that? What does it show? What do you see when you look at a brain map?
We work with several different types of brain mapping databases. These are large numbers of people who have had their brain mapped. They are considered average, and when you have that information and you compare your map or someone else's map to the average, it quickly identifies on a picture how much of certain activity you have compared to the average, and highlights where there is a difference between your brain and average. Kind of like when you go to school, are you in the 90th percentile? Are you in the 2th percentile? And what we look for in that picture is any, so to speak, areas where you have too much activity, and that gets highlighted often in red, and too little activity, and that might get highlighted in blue, or sometimes there are different colors for different systems. But by quickly being able to identify what areas of the brain are significantly different, in the 1 percentile or 2 percentile, you can begin to highlight where are some of the potential problem areas compared to the average, and target in on where you need to identify tackling the problem.
And do you have any examples that can help illustrate what you're saying to us, what brain maps show?
Sure. I had a 20-year-old come. His dad thought he was just freeloading. His mom thought that something had happened to him his brain was not functioning well. He had been actually quite a smart kid. And we did a brain map on him, and it showed a really significant amount of what is called slow activity, way slow in the front of his brain. I mean, big red spots showing up on the map. You can look at that and say, with that kind of slow activity, what does that frontal lobe area actually do? Well, one of the key things it does is motivation, getting things done. He was sitting around at home almost unable to get anything done, but when you looked at his map, you saw there is something physically wrong with his brain that is interfering with his ability to get up and go. And that had not been clear. And when we went through this with the dad, who happens to be an MD, the mom told me later it's the first time the dad understood there was actually a real problem to deal with. As it turns out, this kid got exposed to some mold, and that was unclear, but there is some literature showing that same pattern correlates to mold exposure. Another example is we get kids all the time who are labeled ADHD all the time. And yet when you do a brain map, they may have some areas of the brain that have correlates to attentional problems, but they often have areas of the brain that relate to problems processing information or sensory integration issues, or there's a 16-year-old I can think of who's very good athlete, but really struggles in school. And she's got this slower activity over the central part of her brain, which is highly correlated with ADHD. But she also has something behind her left ear that's very correlated with learning disabilities. So all their strategies for ADHD had really not addressed her problem, because she has this learning issue that was kind of hidden by the ADHD. We also see a lot of kids who should be labeled Asperger's or obsessive or anxious who get labeled as ADHD instead. So ADHD is kind of a catch-all for kids, it's kind of, and adults. It's kind of a catch-all diagnosis, whereas there are many different kinds of problems that contribute to attention issues. And if you're anxious, if you're struggling to learn because you can't keep up in class, it may often look like an attentional problem, but it's not just attention that's creating the problem. And if you don't have a picture of that, it's very hard to sort that out, even often with testing, because their attention does look like it's bad, but it's not bad for the reason people think. So too often we see some of these kids on stimulant meds. Well, there's only about 30% of the kids who have ADHD have a pattern, have a brain pattern that tends to do well with stimulants. So that means 70% of the kids are being given meds, and adults, by the way, are being given meds that aren't always appropriate to the problem that they're dealing with.
And the brain map can help weed those sorts of misdiagnoses out.
That's correct. It not only helps weed them out, but it helps you come up with strategies that address the problem better. And I had a 10-year-old boy who had been diagnosed with ADHD, but then there was a question about whether maybe he was Asperger's. Did he have social problems? What was the issue? And he'd been to 3 or 4 specialists. When we got the brain map back, it became extremely clear that not only did he have some attentional issues, but his particular pattern suggested to not do stimulants, that stimulants would actually create a problem for him, and that he clearly had an area of his brain that was significant related to social connection, how he socially interacts with others, that was a problem. And that pattern is typical of Asperger's. So we got a very clear picture about 2 key issues that they had been struggling for years to identify with the top experts in the area. And it would have been a lot easier to have looked at a picture of the brain and go, what's going on here?
So do all neurofeedback clinicians use a QEEG brain map?
They do not, and we do not always use it.
What are some of the reasons why you decide to always use it or decide not to use one?
Honestly, it would probably be nice to have a brain map for everyone we see, but there is a cost. And so it's not that inexpensive a test. There are many problems that you work with neurofeedback that we understand what systems of the brain create some of those problems. In other words, we already know that if you're dealing with certain kinds of attentional issues, if you're dealing with certain kinds of processing issues or sensory integration issues, we may be able to target some of those issues without having a brain map. If someone has emotional control problems, in other words, they get excessively emotional, they get excessively upset or angry, we know that the temporal lobes are involved and we have to tackle those. So we may start training someone, just like when you go to a doctor, they don't do all the tests all at once. They often say, well, let's try what we know, and then if that isn't effective enough, we will then come back and say, let's do a map at this point. Let's really take a picture. So sometimes we get really good response with targeting, training the brain using the neurofeedback, even in a few sessions. But there are many cases in which it's a more complicated situation. It's something, if someone has been dealing with a problem for years, even kids, they've been to lots of different specialists. We know it's complicated. We pretty much want a map when we can.
So what are the limitations of a brain map?
It would be nice to say that you read a brain map, and this is, by the way, true for any type of brain mapping technology. You see a picture of the brain and you know exactly what's going on. It doesn't work quite that way. What the quantitative EEG does is it highly correlates with functional parts of the brain. How we think, how we manage our emotions, sleeping, attention, how we interact with others, how, upset or calm we are able to stay. Those are parts of the brain that gives us very good information about. But everybody's brain looks a bit different. Some people may have a pattern and it gives them a little bit of a problem. The same pattern might be a much worse problem for somebody else. And you can't tell the severity of the problem. You also may have 7 or 8 different areas of the brain that have areas that are, significantly different from the average. And you can't necessarily tackle all those at once. And maybe not all those areas are actually problems. I mean, we all learn to adapt. I think if you took a brain map of many people, certain areas that they are less good at than others, and that could be identified. The limitations are you can't identify the severity of the problem, and you can't always identify, well, which of these 8 problems are actually causing this particular issue. It may be several, and when we say we don't understand that, really this is neuroscience. Does neuroscience understand the brain well enough that they can identify how this very complex system, how it all works together? That's still being understood, but there's so much information we do get that's highly correlated to a problem that it is still very useful information and gets us far closer to tackling the problem that person is experiencing, or the area of the brain that's just not performing as well as it should, including sleep and how well you do in school. These are fundamental to how well your brain works. And when it runs too slow or too fast, or it's not connected from one area to another, it can have huge implications that may not take that much to change.
And for the person receiving the brain map, what is that process like? Tell me how it's done.
You put a bunch of sensors, which are also called electrodes. Electrodes measure the electrical activity in your brain. I hope everybody knows that your brain makes electricity. These electrodes don't put anything in, they simply measure it. So all you're doing is putting about 21 sensors on your head with a little bit of goop to get them to stick. It's a little bit of a bad hair day. And you record, so it takes anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes to put those on, and then you measure about anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes of information, and then that information, which is recorded, then gets processed. We often send some of ours out to some specialists that we use that produce a report that says, how does your brain compare? Do I make too much or too little activity compared to others? And that report might take 2 weeks to come back. Sometimes it's quicker, sometimes a little longer. But then we sit down with the parents. Sometimes even children like to hear this, but rarely. But we typically sit down with adults or with parents and go through the map in detail, discussing what the areas that are highlighted mean, and discussing which of these are actually the most critical issues that they face. And what's remarkable over many years of doing this is how closely these kinds of patterns that show up in the map really correlate with the kind of problem that people have. If your brain doesn't work well, or if your brain is firing too fast or too slow, or one area is not connected to another, when you look at what that area is supposed to do, because different parts of your brain do different things, it's really remarkable how much it ties to the kind of problems that people face. For example, people who can't shut off their brain, in other words, their brain just keeps going, and sometimes that could be called obsessive, but it could also be worrying. Those are frontal lobe issues typically, not always, but typically, and you have to know, where is it coming from? And when you see in the map this kind of hot pattern, in other words, way too much of certain kind of activity over the front part of just above your forehead, you can almost guess that that could be obsessive thinking, potentially worry, or even oppositional behavior, because that same area plays a role in how well you switch gears, how flexible you are. So if that area of the brain's not working well, you may become very inflexible, and that's not because you want to, it's because your brain's not switching gears well.
One other question back to the process for the person who's having it done. Are they sitting, lying down? Do they feel anything? What is it like for them during the process?
They are sitting in a chair, comfortable chair. We typically, while we're hooking them up, have them watch a video or sometimes, just listen to music. And it's a pretty comfortable process. Putting the sensors on the head is very easy. It doesn't hurt. It's just taking something and just sticking it on your head. You, on occasion, have kids who are very sensory defensive. So if you even touch their head, even with your finger, they don't like it. And so those kids are a little bit more of a challenge. And we have some ways that we will sometimes send the sensors home with parents in advance and have them play games with it, so it's not new to the kids. And we've never had anyone that we couldn't do a map on eventually, but there are certain kids you don't necessarily start out right away. They need to get more used to just doing like 2 or 3 at a time rather than 21, so we work with that. But most adults and most kids, it's simple, it's easy, they don't mind it at all.
Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about some specific situations where people might find themselves. You've mentioned a little bit about autism, ADHD, Asperger's, but tell me more specifically, how would a brain map impact autism, or how does it show what you know about autism?
The map gives us a much better understanding of what kinds of problems that we are dealing with. And is this a kid in the spectrum that has sensory issues? Well, a lot of times the parents know that. Is this a kid that has really difficulty with gaze, looking at somebody in their eyes? Is this somebody that, gets extremely hyper and can't calm themselves down? Do they flap? Some kids flap and some don't. Is there issues with executive function, meaning attention, really hard making decisions or making appropriate decisions? They're very developmentally delayed often, but they're often early on potentially labeled as ADHD, and then, some kids it's very clear are in the spectrum. The map gives us so much better information about how much is this social emotional system in the brain being affected, how much is their prefrontal lobe and frontal lobe, which plays a role in obsessive kind of behavior. A lot of the kids end up doing a lot of repeating or obsessive kinds of things. All of these things, we get much better clues as a result of the map, not only about what areas, because some of the areas we already know, but more specifically, what type of specific training. There's all these different frequencies of brain patterns in your brain, and sometimes one type of frequency is significantly off and others look relatively normal. So when you have tools that allow you to really fine-tune the training, typically that's going to make the training go faster. It's going to allow you to get more productive change. And all that the map is doing is giving us a roadmap, a more specific roadmap as to how to get these kids to help train to make changes in these areas that are problems. And literally all neurofeedback does is to help train patterns to change. And when those patterns change, you see functional improvements. And more importantly, when you do a brain map at the beginning, and then if you do another brain map, you will see significant changes from the first brain map to the second that typically correlate with improvements that the parents or the individuals are reporting back to us. So the map is not just specific to targeting change and training change. It shows you pre and post what kind of progress are you making. A lot of the kids in autism and Asperger's, because these are more significant brain issues, they're developmental delays, we perceive that part of what we do is to increase their brain's activity in areas that speed up their developmental process. Now, that's not been well proven. There are a couple of research projects, but there needs to be more research in that. But that's what appears to occur when you have brain maps and when you have targeted training. You see changes that are reported as developmental improvements. And that, the maps help us achieve often more effectively. I will also say there are people out there who train without using brain maps, and they also can report some improvements. Our experience and many of my colleagues I work with feel that they get a more targeted progress when you have the map.
We've talked a fair bit about brain mapping with children, and also that's of course applicable to adults, but specifically with adults, is brain mapping helpful for things like dementia, Alzheimer's, memory?
So I have had my wife and my staff at times in the last year complain about my memory. I did a brain map to determine if some of the areas of my brain were starting to have issues, and as it turns out, over my left temporal lobe, I do have some slower activity. The left temporal lobe plays a critical role in memory. When I work with many different clients, and I work with people who are like me, who are in their 50s and are concerned about their memory, or people who are in their 60s and 70s and even 80s who have significant memory issues. They're either early in dementia or Alzheimer's, or definitely concerned that they have what is called mild cognitive impairment. And when you do a map, you get a much clearer picture of what areas, again, of the brain that are very involved in what is called executive function, being able to make good decisions, being able to focus on things, being able to make judgments. And the left side of over your left ear, there's a whole system that plays a role in memory, how you store memory, how you retrieve memory. And in the prefrontal lobe, which is like over your left eye, it plays a critical role in what is called short-term working memory, which is how you store things. So we don't always know what the person is really dealing with. And when you see the map you get a much better idea. I have a woman that was she's 75. She functions pretty well, but her daughter was extremely concerned because she gets overwhelmed very easily, significant memory issues, significant issues in being able to just process information quickly. If you tell her something, she may really struggle to get it if it's more than very simple. And when we did a brain map, she really did not have a dementia problem, but she did have a lack of activity in certain critical areas that your brain, in other words, your brain has to work at a certain speed for it to function well. And hers was just going way too slow, but that's not a typical dementia pattern. And she wasn't really at that dementia level, but her daughter was very concerned. We have since trained that area as a result of the map, and it is almost normal. And she is functioning so much better. She says, I'm like I used to be. Now, that doesn't mean that can happen with everybody, because some people's brains have way more problems and there are significant neurological issues. Dementia and Alzheimer's is considered to be a significant neurological issue. But even if there are those problems, can your brain be trained to do better? Yes. And also, is it helpful to have a picture to understand, well, what kind of problems are we really dealing with? Because going to a neurologist to get diagnosed, but often doing an MRI tells you some things, but doing a quantitative EEG gives you a much better idea of your cognitive functioning. And, that's really a lot of what we're dealing with.
Do you have any last thoughts, anything that I haven't asked about brain mapping and its importance in helping with neurofeedback and brain training?
I think the biggest reason that I have done more and more brain mapping over the years, as well as my colleagues, is because someone comes in and because you're experienced with these kind of problems, you think that you know what areas of the brain are going to be the problem. And when you do the brain map, you get surprised some percentage of the time that, boy, this isn't what I thought it was at all. I'll give you an example of, actually, two examples. One was a kid who really looked like he was ADHD, and he's been treated for ADHD with stimulant meds for several years. But when we looked at the map, though he did have an ADHD problem, he really has a significant learning disability that showed up quite significantly in the map. And it also happens to be over the temporal area, which plays a role in emotional control. So this kid got very emotional, and that was hard to figure out what that was. But boy, when you saw the brain map, you realized, oh, we're just dealing with a small part of this kid's problem. And we've made much more progress since we had that map, and since the parents actually understand what they're dealing with, because the dad didn't really understand the problem until he got to understand the map. In an adult case, I had this 54-year-old guy, very nice guy, and he's been dealing with depression for 8 years, really significantly. He'd been treated by a whole lot of different doctors, a whole lot of different medications. And there's a particular area of the brain that plays a critical role in mood and depression. And when we did the brain map, that's not where the problem was at all. So we started digging in. It turned out that he had a hit on the head. In his case, he had a whiplash in a car wreck that didn't seem to be a problem at the time. Well, actually, a whiplash is a mild head injury, but no one told him that. And it took about a year or two before the symptoms started to get worse. That is very typical of having a head injury, except he was told that there was no problem with his brain. After they did an MRI, there's no problem, you're fine. And then a year or two later, he'd always had a little bit of depression, but now the depression became overwhelming. We looked at the brain map, and lo and behold, it's not in the area that you ever think plays a role in depression. Well, it's in an area near the temporal lobe, and that does affect emotional control and emotional regulation, but it's not in the area that you typically think of at all. He's been treated wrong for years because nobody looked at his brain. And unfortunately, I can't figure out which of the people have the wrong diagnosis until I do the map.
So really, for anyone with a head injury, this would be a really viable tool to give you a much better picture of what's happening.
There's no question of that. And I must admit, there are other types of brain mapping that can be used to look at brain injury, but frankly, they're often not used correctly, even by MDs. So sometimes we get involved after we get a QEEG or quantitative EEG, or even just during a history, we will sometimes suggest that even some other type of mapping that looks at more structural issues in the brain may be appropriate. And often people just never had someone spend enough time, which is a problem for many doctors, to figure out that they really had a potential head injury that should be looked at more closely. So we really are able to take the time to help people figure out what's going on in their brain, and often a QEEG is a very good tool, but it's frankly not the only thing that we end up recommending.
Well, Mike, thank you very much for your time today. This has been very informative.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.